Но то, что вот этот Алеша известно Болгарии всей.
One thing I want to ask though is, so like you're in California, how are the fires in terms of like when I was reading about this, like Portland had the most like the worst air quality in the world at some point, maybe for like a few days or so. Does that mean that you're not like they're suggesting that you don't leave the house, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So in the fires, well, let me back up. I moved here August of 2018. And immediately after I moved here, there was the campfire out toward Paradise in the Sierras or right near the Sierras, which was massive. And that year's air quality resulting from the winds pushing that smoke our way, I think San Francisco had the worst in the world for a week, maybe two. And that is pretty much the advice, is to stay indoors. They'll put out what I forget the exact name for it, but essentially they tell nobody to even burn a candle in your home to add to, the air quality or making it any worse. And you're advised to stay inside. At that time, everyone was advised to buy N95 grade masks. So just interesting that some people maybe still had those on hand and came in handy for COVID. But last year we had bad air quality as well at one point. Same idea, fires burning. Like where I live is about an hour north of San Francisco. And so last year we had fires all around us. This year it's been the same, one an hour to the north, east, and south. And so it just, it gets very, it looks as though it's just fog, but it's smoke. And the one
is it still this way now? Like, I assume it's not like red skies anymore. Like what does it look like? Yeah.
So right now it's clear where I live, but I can't really vouch for other towns. Maybe it's still quite bad, but yeah. So about 2 weeks ago, for a 2 or 3 day stretch, it looked as though it was 8 p.m. all day long. And in my town, the skies were kind of a yellowish green, down in San Francisco, spread all over the news, obviously, were those orange photos, which was intense. And the only thing that's been slightly better about it this year is that not nearly as many human-made structures have burned. And so the smoke, while still bad, is not considered as toxic with all those particles from asbestos and steel and metal and wood. So it's, if anything, it's been slightly better this year, but we're still very much in the midst of it. The fire that raged when I first moved here happened in November. And the multiple ones around here last year were in October. So, to already have had by end of August, really bad fires raging is not good. And we still have a couple months probably of waiting this out.
Yeah. It just makes me think when you mentioned the masks, one thing that's pretty obvious now is the fact that we don't have that manufacturing capacity, right? That is, in a technical sense, like people don't think of it as a national security concern, but this obviously is something that would be part of like a broad discussion of national security, right? I understand that, on some level, there's certain things that you don't want to go back to, right? Like if China is the best at what it does in terms of like some elements of manufacturing, you don't have to say as a country, like, okay, we want to compete with China on all these fronts. Like you could sort of do what you do best, but there needs to be some level of like native manufacturing capacity, right? Whether it's, something as simple as being able to make masks or, like honestly, like if we had like an actual World War II situation with the possibility of like, land strikes against us, let's say, do we have the capacity right now to be able to, manufacture the things that we need? I'm not even so sure about that.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you there. And we've seen this call for, companies doing something totally different to convert their assembly lines overnight. Obviously, back where I grew up in Michigan, Ford and General Motors have been asked to manufacture masks, at least for a time. I don't know if they still are. But and even that all happened quite late, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
By now we know the story in terms of how the administration has handled it. So I agree. You do still need to have some kind of capability to pretty much at the snap of the finger, put something in place to help on these things.
And, as tempting as it is, we should probably save like all the additional political stuff for the artifact, for the comments, for all that. And what brought upon this conversation was, I've been thinking how I grew up, right? It interested me when I first met you and you said that you grew up religious, because it feels like most of the people that are, my friends now, they sort of like never, they either were never really religious or they shook it off very quickly, which was not my experience. Like I know, for example, Dan, he's, I remember reading his memoirs, like that he knew, like by the time he was maybe 6 years old, that religion was bullshit. And to me, like, it's just incomprehensible to think that at 6 years old, right, I had, and this could just be kind of like native differences in, psychological like inclinations towards believing certain things or wanting to believe certain things or what have you. But I grew up like with religious feeling. I grew up with religion, period. I grew up with a Russian Orthodox church, which has its own kind of interesting features in the sense that, maybe there's like some element of, well, maybe we could say that all of it is superstition in the sense that, like, let's say like modern American Catholicism, like obviously you could, point to pretty much anything in that religion as a superstition of some sort. But the interesting part with Russian Orthodoxy is, you're starting essentially with a mostly peasant population a century ago, right? This is a peasant country, very uneducated by modern standards. So you're going to get this interesting combination of kind of like native superstitions. Like I wouldn't call them like, it wasn't a pagan country, a century ago, but there definitely were things like in Russia, we have something called the domovoi, which means like a house spirit. And this actually goes back to like Slavic paganism. And that just kind of stuck, right? Like, I guess technically, like if you speak to an Orthodox primate, which is kind of like an elder, he would tell you that no, you're not supposed to believe these kinds of things, but the Russian population does, right? And it's kind of like very weirdly enmeshed in religion, in the same way that like early Christianity just took on so many of the pagan myths surrounding it, right? Like to make Christianity and something like Christmas more palatable, right? Let's just celebrate it at the end of the year when we have all these other pagan festivities coming, and then eventually it's just going to meld into one. But so I grew up with a lot of that. I grew up with a lot of what we would, I guess, term outside of the religion itself, like these kinds of like superstitious fears. And I just want to see how our upbringings compare in that regard, because we've never actually talked about it in any kind of depth. And I figured, if we talk about it, might as well make a show out of it. And if we make a show out of it, we need to have an art component. And what better art component than possibly it maybe is the best book in the Bible, Ecclesiastes. So before we get to like the art itself, why don't you like tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you ultimately just kind of disconnected from religion?
Sure. So similar to what you said, I can't imagine at 6 having already made these kind of realizations. So if that's the case for Dan, then I would probably call that quite unique. And I also would be interested to hear from him at some point how much religion was, part of the fabric of his family and their history, because I know for me, that was the main component for a very long time, is simply that my grandparents, and as far as I know, great grandparents, were quite religious. I think even my great grandfather on my father's side was a missionary to India, and then maybe one other family member of my grandfather's had been, perhaps his brother or sister. I forget all those details, but very, very involved to the tune of orienting an entire life and life's work around it. And then that obviously passed down just through the family line. And so my parents both grew up in those environments and remained that way themselves. And then my sister and I, growing up in their household, it was just part of the fabric of life. So, probably from the age of, I would guess, well, maybe birth on, but certainly kindergarten and beyond, when I was beginning to grow and develop and learn, I was in church 2 to 3 times a week, all the way from that age up until I graduated high school. And then when I did go to college, I ended up attending a Christian college, just a small liberal arts school in Illinois. And I had gone back and forth on, whether to do that or to go to a larger university or a secular college, and, decided that I would go to Wheaton. And there were a few other factors to it and reasons, but so that, then left me still in the Christian sphere and expanding that worldview. I think when I went to college, I thought, okay, this is when I will study harder and drill down further on some of the core tenets of this belief system, and really try to justify it or ingrain it, in my life even further, and realize that there can be some kind of, more intellectual grounding to it and heft to it. And it'll go beyond, mere feeling or mere spirituality, if you will. And so, for the first couple of years, that was probably the case. And, we were required to take biblical studies courses as part of the curriculum, and then also required to be in, what was called chapel at school, but essentially a church service, 3 times a week, and then as Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then usually go to actual church on Sunday too. So, being in that environment around a, good number of intelligent peers and everything else did serve that purpose for a time. But I think, as time went on, maybe my junior and senior year, I just became more and more focused on, what am I going to do after this? What does life look like? And am I preparing myself well enough for it? And so just kind of my studies and, I played tennis at college and stuff. So these other things just took more of my focus and more of a front seat. And I think I found myself becoming just a little bit more, lax about the whole thing. And then after I graduated and, got my first job and just kind of entered work life and all these things, I was realizing I hadn't drilled down particularly hard on the other side, and had kind of just taken all these arguments I had heard at face value. And so I just started seeking out secular works and, more focused on science and philosophy, and realizing that, a lot of the Christian faith to me, had been this pattern in my life, and something that I always did. And the more I questioned it, the more I just felt that it seems clear that there are other explanations for what we see in the world. And a lot of the core tenets tend not to hold up. And so it was a gradual thing, probably from age 23 to 25 in particular, just a lot of reading and contemplating. And I think I just realized one day that I had sort of phased out, and it's been that way since. So,
did you grow up with favorite religious texts or religious prayers, or just what part of the religious culture affected you in some way? Like what like is there anything like to this day that affects you, or like how did that look like when you were growing up?
Yeah, so there were. I read the Bible a lot, and even put a lot of effort into memorizing long passages of it, and the entire structure of the Bible, and even some historical context around it. And then outside of that, I don't think in my teen years I was reading anything that would be categorized by like a religious scholar as something deeply scholarly, but things like C.S. Lewis or the Lord of the Rings trilogy from Tolkien. And then there were like a fair number of kind of pop proselytizer type personalities, right? So I don't know if these names mean anything to you, but someone like a Rob Bell or a Donald Miller wrote these books that became like really popular in the evangelical Christian world because they were more like edgy and kind of like giving examples of people living life as Christians, but kind of attempting to deal with some of the more challenging social issues and these kind of things. And of course, they were considered like heretics by a lot of people, for even engaging with these questions. So stuff like that was influential for a while. And man, I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my bookshelf here just to see if there's anything else. Thomas Merton, a little bit of Thomas Merton. New Seeds of Contemplation was a book of his, and then another book called The Intellectual Life, which was by a French monk named A.G. Sertilanges, and that was another one I kind of used to justify this idea that maybe I could live a creative or intellectual life and, do that within the context of Christianity.
Yeah, I noticed that's a pretty, that pattern is somewhat similar to mine in the sense that, as you're sort of coming of age, and you kind of see this in the macro, like with some of the books that you listed, like if these are sort of, popular explanations of explorations of religion, and they're meant to be somewhat edgy, right? The only reason why that's the case is like in the modern world, like religion just sort of has to like engage in all these compromises, right? It has to compromise with itself and it has to compromise with society because, there's certain things like that you can't stand for and that you can't allow, right? Like even like basic issues now that seem kind of like obvious to most Christians, like most Christians now, if you were to sort of like stop them on the street and ask them, so, do you think that, a good Jew would go to hell? They would say, no, I think, all good people, go to heaven. Right. Which is like, that's clear. That's obviously not biblical. And now, but even like even the Pope, right? Even the Pope is saying that people of, various faiths or even people of no faiths, that are otherwise good people, they can make it into heaven because, just a purely like, logical conundrum of, well, if you think about it, it's just a purely statistical argument in the sense that if you're born, anywhere outside of a typical Christian nation, you're simply not going to be Christian. You're going to be the religion of whoever, whatever, your locale is. And, and then you would have to justify yourself. Well, on the one hand, like, I believe that God is just. And then on the other hand, God is essentially allowing these people to be born in these situations that are, usually impoverished situations to begin with. And on top of that, they go to hell because of the circumstances of their religious upbringing, right? Like no normal sane person wants to believe that. And you sort of notice that like, you start making these adjustments and you start making these like arguments in your own head. Like, so, how can I live the life that I want to live, but also, make it spiritually satisfying or make it somehow respectful of my like specific, like religious upbringing. And the way that I would do that with myself is like, by the time I was like, maybe like 14, 15 years old, I already knew enough about, the world and science that much of what's in the Bible was not, was simply wrong. And my way out of that was like by the time I was maybe like 15, I was reading a lot of like religious philosophy, and specifically to like justify, right? To justify belief. Like, what are good philosophical arguments, right? It was always like for a very specific motivation. The motivation was, how can I justify a personal belief, right? How can I, like what are the best arguments for God? And I remember there was this website that was kind of popular when I was growing up called like godandscience.org. And I would like read the articles all the time. I would read about the sciences from that perspective. Of course, like, almost everything on that website, I'm not sure if it still exists, I would now, realize is bullshit. And, like even the philosophical arguments, it seems to me as if there haven't been any real philosophical arguments for God's existence that haven't already been addressed at some point, like centuries ago, right? I feel like all the rebuttals have more or less been made. I don't think there is too much new stuff to deal with after David Hume, although there are like some fine-tuning arguments. And like I remember when I was a kid, the fine-tuning argument was like my last, was my last emotional refuge. Well, back then it was like my last intellectual refuge, right? But really it was an emotional refuge because of the way that the argument is structured. And for people that might not know, the fine-tuning argument for God's existence goes something like, look at the universe. Look at how balanced it is. Look at how specifically tailored it is for your personal existence, right? Like, had things been even just a little bit different, right? Let's say that heat in the universe was like distributed differently. You change like, or even just like, the kinds of, single-celled organisms that we had at the beginning. Let's say those are a little bit different. You could say that maybe eventually we would still get to the point of intelligent life. And in fact, I think that is like, if you're starting with a single cell organisms, I think it's pretty, certain that eventually you will get intelligence, simply because like, just from a purely like mechanistic perspective, intelligence emerges just at the point where that is the thing that is just, competitive genetically speaking, right? Because intelligence just has such massive benefits in terms of, that competitive edge, you would expect that over a long enough span of time, a planet like the Earth, perhaps not every single planet, but a planet like the Earth would probably emerge with some form of life. So I would look at the fine-tuning argument and I would say, hey, look, the universe seems to be so tailored for me. And I remember like this sound like such a knockout argument for me. And I remember I was like on some like music message board. And I remember like arguing, there was like an off topic, this portion of the site, I guess. And I remember arguing with somebody about fine tuning, and the guy was like, okay, well, this is what you believe about fine tuning, but, if what you're saying is true, right, that had things been different, you wouldn't be around. Like, that's the answer, right? Like, had things been different, Alex, like, you wouldn't be around to have this discussion. Like, even if you believe that the universe keeps like, expanding and crunching, let's say you accept Big Bang, Big Crunch, and this keeps happening, infinitely, right? Over and over and over again. Well, it could be that you had 1 trillion universes before this one that had no life at all because it wasn't fine tuned for the specific kind of carbon life that we're talking about, that is us. And now, after 1 trillion times, guess what? You are now conscious here. You're allowed to talk about it, since now finally you exist. And you are making the mistake that this is somehow special, that this is the miracle, when in fact, everything else was just as special. It just wasn't conscious, right? And I remember when it was put to me in that way, I was like 16 years old. I was like, holy shit, like, he's right. Like, I made the decision, like, okay, like, I have to, like, I can't ignore this. And I remember for like the next like month, I was like sort of practicing and training myself to like not believe in God. Like, when religion would come up, I would train myself to be like dismissive of it. I would train myself to like, reject the arguments. And then I remember at some point, like, making these like secular arguments against religious people, like a month into this like change, and I was thinking like, fuck, like what the fuck am I doing? As much as one could say you were a religious person and now it's done, I think I've sort of been through that. But I think the process is akin to like, forms of addiction, right? Where people say, you're never truly cured of addiction. You're just like a recovering alcoholic, even if you haven't, even if you haven't drunk alcohol in like 50 years, right? You're still recovering in the sense that, you could easily fall back in those patterns. So, maybe I think it's more accurate to say that I am a recovering religious person. I have like tons of like, existential angst. I have tons of like guilt. I'm not sure to what degree it comes from religion. It could just be as simple as I'm a person that is just psychologically primed to believe certain things. I am like, I'm not sure if I'd call myself superstitious, but I do things that might not be totally rational. Like I spend like maybe, $100 a month on various like fucking nutritional supplements. I do research them. I do like enjoy reading this kind of stuff. And I think there's definitely evidence for them. But I think it's also like, it does strike me sometimes, like when I'm fucking sitting with like, my mushroom powders or like a little, here, I already took it this morning, a little like metal till, like it's this big because it has to be this full. Like when I'm sitting around this kind of shit, like I just start thinking like how much of this is just like my inclination to want to believe certain things, to rationalize certain things. Because, and I'm sure you could sort of vouch for this for yourself. Like I am a master of rationalization. I have to be very aware of this. I could trick myself into all sorts of garbage. Like I almost tricked myself into voting for Biden this year. So I have to be very aware of the kinds of things that are in my life. And it makes me wonder, like, was that like the effect of religion, or is that simply, no, Alex, this is just kind of who you are interpersonally, psychologically, this is your blueprint. And you sort of went with it, right? So, maybe that explains why Dan is the way that he is, and why it took me 10 years after him, like well into my teenage years to switch that. And like, I just want to ask you, like, if you have any responses to that, and also like whether, you have any comments, because like you're I think you're 30 now, right? Or close to it. So it's been like only 5 years since you sort of like really left religion.
Sure. It's a good question. And I spend time every once in a while trying to ask those questions of myself and break it down. And I think that, one thing that is coming to mind right now is just maybe the sense of duty in life, this kind of both like the Protestant work ethic, but also the tendency to treat yourself as sinful. It can expand, even if you're secular, into simply a tendency to always tell yourself you're coming up short of something. And it can be very nebulous. There doesn't even have to be a specific goal. It can be, and I do feel this, and I will communicate this to myself via self-talk fairly often. Just, like you're just being so shitty right now. You're not working hard enough. You're not trying hard enough. You're coming up, well short of it in all these different categories of life. And then in my more clear moments, if I like sit down, and sometimes I'll even force myself to write just like journal entry type things about this versus like a poem or something more serious, and just kind of like put down on a piece of paper what my life is actually about right now, and what I've done and what I still aim to do. And I even had a moment kind of like this yesterday. I was reorganizing some notes that I've taken on different books and videos and whatever over the past year or two, and looking back at some goals I had written down, that in that time frame, and realizing that like I've accomplished some of them and some of them I haven't. But even like a week or two ago, I was in this like mindset where I was like convinced everything was just hot garbage in my life, as far as like my ambitions and what I really want to do. And then I looked at this piece of paper, I was like, wow, I actually have done a couple of those things, and like not really stopped to give myself any credit for it, and be like positive and try to reinforce that I can build on on those things going forward, which I think is a carryover for sure from, from that religious mindset and kind of the masochistic nature that it can take on in its more intense form. So for sure, that's one thing. I don't view that entirely as a negative, though, because my mindset a lot of the time is if I don't push myself to do certain things, nobody else is going to do that. So maybe if in a religious context, it's pursuit of righteousness or a higher moral ground or whatever you want to call it, where it's misdirected and people become convinced that they have a corner on these things because, some multiple thousands-year-old patchwork book is telling them so. It can still pervade your life from that standpoint. So I think that's one. And I do also have like these times where no matter how well positioned I think I am or justified in certain, worldviews or beliefs I have now, I'll still like wonder if it's really right or if this really is okay. Even like I'm in a new room from the last time that we did one of these because I moved and now I moved in with my girlfriend. And so like I had been married before in my early 20s and then got divorced about a year and a half ago. I think it finalized about a year ago now. And so like the thought of, like meeting someone new, falling in love with them, and then like cohabitating with them is still ingrained as a no, right? From like my early days. And so, you
still feel that specifically?
Yeah. But I know that it's perfectly fine. Right.
Yeah.
Like my new self, my rational self is just like, this is just me living life with someone that I enjoy being with. It's the exact same thing as being married to somebody, except there's not the legal documentation and a couple rings and a ceremony or whatever. But there is this tiny little piece back there that's still like, but is that right? Like, is this an okay thing to do? Because for so long, you're told that it's not right. It's just not how you operate and run your life according to these tenets. So those things do flare up from time to time, no question. And maybe, what we could do is pivot to something you said to me in our show notes where you've wondered if that framework, though, you sublimated it into a drive toward the arts. This kind of place taking of the arts and working toward that rather than religion. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. And also, whether it's part of this or maybe a separate answer, one thing I do find myself falling into, not particularly often or intensely, but still slightly from time to time. And maybe this feeds into some of the political things we might talk about later. But I do think that even once you extract yourself from religion and become, fairly certain that at minimum we can't know there's a God and it's likely there isn't one, period, there's still a search for it. And it does create a void. I think even in particular, when you think about Christianity, the role of Jesus and the person of Jesus, and we still maybe look for messiahs, in life. So a person maybe in specific, or at minimum, some kind of cause or group that you can be part of that takes the place of that, because it is very comforting as a human, right? To have some kind of greater thing than yourself or a leader who can lead you, and then to be part of that troop. And I do think that's a dangerous thing often overall. So you have to be cognizant of it, but I think it's an easy thing to do. A lot of people seem to do that with, with political figures anymore, but
this reminds me of, so like when I, also like around the time that I was 16, I became a Marxist, and that actually overlapped with, being a Christian, right? So for a few months after I became a Marxist, I was still like for like half a year a Christian, and I would I would get into arguments with like other communists about that, because obviously most communists are not religious at all. But I remember also after I left religion, and I was still in this kind of like Marxist mindset. whenever I would see kind of like, I guess like cartoon representations of like my favorite Marxist figures or whatever, I would definitely get very, very strong God vibes, right? Like it felt extremely similar. I remember one in particular. There was this like one dumb fucking comic like book thing where like Lenin came back to like fight with Stalin, and he was like shooting a fucking ray out of his hands at him. And then I remember like I literally started rooting, and like before even turning the pages, I started rooting in my mind, like, yeah, just fucking get him. Cause and part of that was, partly was because like, that was still, I guess, for my phase where I thought there was actually a very big difference between Lenin and Stalin, when like now I realize like, Lenin simply, started the infrastructure and started doing the things that Stalin essentially perfected, which is just kind of like weird. Cause like you think about it, like how like, there was for so long this like, movement, there was the Leninist Trotskyist movement, like they are like the orthodox Marxists, and Stalin was like the aberration, when like, if had things been a little different and Trotsky would have won out, Russia would not have like a Stalin-like figure would have been Trotsky, right? So that seems inevitable. But I remember having these like religious kind of feelings, and I mean, honestly, like the heights of my religious feelings when I was a kid, right? And the examples would be like, I remember when I was like 8, I was very adamant that I was gonna like when I but it's kind of funny when I think about it now, because in my mind it was when I turn 30, I'm going to become a monk. And I guess in my head, I wanted to turn 30 because I wanted to like have a time in my life where I could go out and drink and do drugs and have sex and, like then do the, St. Augustine shit of, now I could finally settle down, right? Like after living this kind of life.
It's time to get serious now. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing that's always the trap, right? Like you always think that if you're ever doing something you feel like you shouldn't be doing, like you sort of trick yourself into thinking like, well, that's not my real life yet. My real life will start. Right. And it's like some other like arbitrary kind of point. But so like that was like a height of like religious feeling. Like I want to like leave all this shit and become a monk. Another one was, and this was from the show notes that I just remembered. Like I remember, I grew up like around like tons of like Hasidic Jews, right, in my neighborhood, and I remember just like looking at them and just being very kind of envious, right, in the sense that, my family, I guess, was religious, but it was religious in the sense that, Russian families are religious, or American families are religious, right? It's kind of like this generic religiosity that might play out in like, oh yeah, they're going to church. Oh yeah, they're praying. But whenever I would look at Hasidic Jews, like it seemed far more serious than that, right?
Yeah.
It seemed like they were actually working on some sort of like lifelong project, and they had this kind of purpose. I just sort of like idealized them as like, their lives must be fucking perfect. Like, what do they have to worry about? They go to their religious schools. They go to their, they and that's the thing. Like, I even knew this as a kid, right? So like when people say that the religious life is really the hard life, well, not to an 8-year-old me, right? That was an escape. And to what degree is it an escape for everybody that is really religious? And not to get off track, but like with those two examples being like height of religious feeling, if I work on something and it turns out really well, like a great paragraph, or like, whatever, like it's a similar feeling, right? If you're working on a book, yes, and there's like you merge with like a great chapter that you've just spent like weeks trying to perfect. It's the same feeling. Yeah. The feeling now that I have this purpose of like leaving something behind, right? That this is what I have to go for. It's the same feeling. And I think we mentioned Shelley Kagan, the first ArtiFact, when he was arguing with William Lane Craig on the kind of like origins of morality. Like, can you have an objective morality without God? And Craig said yes. And Shelley said, no, you don't need God. The way that he phrased it was, well, if there's a God out there and he tells you that, oh, yes, I am God, I am the supreme being, and I'm telling you that objectively, this is what you must do. You have to follow, the 10 commandments. You could just as easily say, so what, to that directive than you can to any other directive. What difference does it make whether you replace God's directive with like accountability towards, I don't know, society, or accountability towards like a future generation? If you really believe that if you make a great work of art, that a future generation can not only learn from, but like, make better in some way, right? What difference does it make whether God tells you to do it or whether society, tells you to do it? Like, to say that objectively, like you still have this infinite regression of so what. You could say so what to absolutely any question in the world, whether or not it's God telling you. If God tells you, well, if you don't follow my rule, you go to hell. Well, what if you say so what to that? Like there's always the possibility of that infinite regress. And like in terms of sublimation, like, I really don't see that big of a difference between my religious life and my present life, because my convictions about what I'm doing now are just as powerful as they were about, God, about, whatever, like, and maybe that's kind of the point, right? When I said earlier about like, what if psychologically this is simply my predilection, right? Maybe that is the answer. Maybe some people are just born with it, or maybe it's Maybelline.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I can agree with you on that last point you just made, where the feelings are very similar. It even harkens back a little bit to artifact number 1 with Maslow, right? And these peak experiences and, the effort to self-actualize. And I think that some people do find that with religion and taking, things as seriously as possible, and the piety of the practice of that religion as intensely as they can. And they, who am I to say that they don't feel that way, and wholly themselves, but also wholly connected to something larger than themselves at the same time. It very much could be possible. Of course, throughout history, because most of history has been religious, we also have predominantly examples of great thinkers and achievers and artists and scientists and whatever, who were religious and felt they were doing this in order to grasp some greater, deeper truth about that very figure that they worshipped all the time anyway. And so do the ends justify the means? I don't know. At a certain point, it's like, well, Newton came up with the theories he did, like whether he thought it was just uncovering a tiny little sliver of God's grandeur, or, there's probably nothing out there, but this seems to be going on. Interesting. The result kind of ends up being the same. But I think now, one of the big things that led me away from religion was the frustration with the God of the gaps, right? And just like, well, anything we don't know, just fill it in with God. And I'm like, well, first of all, you could fill it in with the universe. It means exactly the same thing. But also, I get frustrated because, and you notice this in the arts too, and this might tie into our discussion in a broader sense, maybe not, but this feeling that people seem to have that we've like finished evolving and we've finished progressing and making discoveries and all this stuff. It's like, what are you talking about? We've got a few thousand years at most of recorded history where human intelligence reached a point that we could actually record this stuff, then reflect on it, then progress it. And we're very early days yet, in the midst of that. And so my sincere hope, and I do think it will happen over time, is that, you and I are living in, the future Stone Age, for generations a long way down the road. And I suppose, maybe part of the drive to create is to be one of those links in the chain where it's people continue to look back and say, oh, this book that Sheremet wrote, that to this day is still something that influences people and how we kind of perceive our existence. But at any rate, I think that to get like so intricately involved in the further study of religions and, thing like roadmaps for human life that we've had for a very long time now, it also, to me, just there's such a law of diminishing returns past a certain point, because I get way more excited by ambiguity and the fact that we don't know, and saying, so that creates hopefully many new avenues for people to continue to find out these things. And just because we don't know it today doesn't mean it's unknowable.
In terms of just like health, right? Like, I think what you just said kind of cuts both ways, in the sense that, so like, you don't feel compelled to like go out there and like go and like fucking argue with like, people that are sort of religious, like, what's wrong with you? Can't you tell that this is just a God of the gaps argument? Like you said it yourself, it's just boring. There's so many more exciting things right now. I remember, again, like when I was 16 and made the decision, okay, I have to become an atheist, or I guess technically an agnostic. When I said out I was going to be an atheist, like I did spend like, I'd say 3 to 6 months, like to cement that, I guess, really arguing hardcore, like about pretty much nothing but religion for a few months, and politics, I guess. Like I would argue about two things: God and communism. God and communism, but then like soon after that, like I came across Countee Cullen. I came across Kazuo Shiguru's The Remains of the Day, and I was like, holy shit! Like I know this is a great novel. I have to figure out why. And that was immediately such a more satisfying and difficult question, because like, yeah, okay, so if David Hume more or less settled kind of like most of the, I guess, not purely scientific arguments in relation to God, like what am I going to be like doing, like talking about this nonsense, right? And you see this in yourself as well, which is why, like, Dan has said this before, but like one of the reasons why like people like Richard Dawkins like rub so many people the wrong way, including me, is this is a guy that used to actually write books about science, and now he says I'm going to write books about why God is why God doesn't exist. And it's like, okay, like can't you leave that for like everybody that doesn't know how to do science? Can't you leave that for everybody that doesn't know that can't make actual like long-term contributions to society? And if you're a healthy person, right, and you forego your religion, and you're like, okay, I'm over it, right? You will move on to other things. If you are someone that has been so damaged by religion and your religious upbringing that you can't help but think about it for the rest of your life, even as you call yourself an atheist, that is not a pursuit that can be resolved intellectually, right? That is something for psychotherapy. That is something that is no longer an intellectual question, right? That is and that's the thing, like it has this veneer of, well, I'm the intellectual. I'm the one that's making these assessments. I'm the one that has, show that in fact God doesn't exist. But, the impetus, like who cares if the conclusion is intellectual, if the impetus from the beginning to end, completely suffused with it, is just emotional, right? And that's the thing that's going to, entrap you. It's going to entrap you to, make you a far more limited person. And it's also going to entrap you, like in the intellectual side of things, it's going to trap you into making like bad arguments because you just, the emotion just got the best of you in that sense. Sure.
Yeah. The switch over to a militant atheist and proselytizing for such, it can be troublesome for sure. And so, yeah, I agree. When you see someone like Dawkins who, has a platform to be able to communicate on science and eventually deviates from that, it does get frustrating. I might feel a little more conflicted about those roles than you do, because I have wondered, like, religion has had the first mover advantage for so long in terms of evangelizing and proselytizing, and people are susceptible to that. Obviously, it's just advertising, right? And we know we're all weak, some more than others, but everybody can be susceptible to that. And so I've wondered before, I'm like, well, even though eventually this stuff does start rubbing me the wrong way, and I think it's a bit of overkill, like maybe we do need somebody like that to just kind of take up the cause for agnosticism, or just even considering religion to not be something you need to have in your life, period, to live well, to at least put it out there so that it's a fair fight in a way, because, religion has these massive institutions, massive funding, all that kind of stuff behind it. And so I don't know. I feel like from time to time, I'm still glad that, someone like a Dawkins or a Hitchens or whoever has just gone into the ring and unboxed some rounds, so that at least there are some punches thrown back the other way. In the context of maybe this Dawkins line we're on for the moment, want to bring up an example of someone like Loren Eiseley, who, maybe we'll do a show on or touch on more heavily in future episodes. But when you look at someone like him, where, it's his arguments are more elegant and more subtle in a way for science and for that more rational view of life, simply because he did what he could do best and wrote. He was a unique blend of artist and scientist with, prodigious capability in both fields. I know that, he's not as revered maybe as a scientist, and didn't necessarily have, huge breakthrough discoveries kind of thing, but he was still prominent in that community. And then, starting with Darwin's Century, he went ahead and kind of had some writings that were more scientifically inclined, but over time he, veered toward this personal essay style and incorporating
which he was criticized for all the time, right? Like it sounds crazy now, right? But people are like, why don't you just write about science?
Right. Stick to the science, which, he still was writing about science, but just in a unique way and in a way that only he could. So that was, perhaps his greatest service, to the world. But, he's also someone that continues to stand out to me for his spiritual questionings. Right. And so in the midst of all of this, especially with a book like The Invisible Pyramid, where he takes a bit of not necessarily a devil's advocate, but kind of a, nervous onlooker's stance toward technology and science and the progress made. And, he's writing these things kind of in light of the, incredible destruction that we were able to reap on one another across the world in the 20th century. And at the end of it, just wondering, what good is this really doing? And is this the best we can do? Have we lost sight of something deeper or perhaps more spiritual? Or, I don't have any pull quotes right in this moment to refer to, but at any rate, he's an example, I think, of someone that pretty much achieved the best that he could, and it's serving both functions, right? Artists can look to the work for something and get an awful lot of mileage out of it. Mm-hmm. And scientists can also still look at his work, and even if it's not, breakthrough or cutting edge to this day, he still was a good scientist, mm-hmm. and an excellent communicator, right? So that served a really important function. I think for quite some time over the past few years, I had thought that if we are able to eventually just kind of continue chipping away at secularization of subsequent generations of people who put less and less credence in the classic religions that have stuck around for a long time now, that we'll totally move on from that and kind of have this just more open, humanistic, free thinking society, and probably still that will be true, mm-hmm. In a larger majority than it is today, and certainly has been in the past. But I do, the more that you just kind of look at the state of the world and human nature, I think that these are things that will hold on tightly. There's something, I'm sure that some other scholars or writers, maybe have spoken about this perhaps quite well and eloquently, but there's something in our nature, that wants to hold on to these things. And so I think it does become a question of the placement of the commitments and convictions, and how productive or how harmful they might be to oneself and to other people and the broader society as time goes by. So I'm kind of fascinated to watch it, play out, because with the proliferation of both information but misinformation now, with the internet and so much connectivity, there's a lot of potential, pitfalls there too. So
like you said you had this discussion with your friend. Like, well, I mean, why don't you rehash that? Like, what is what was the conflict there?
Sure. So yeah, this is a friend, not a super close friend, but someone that I used to know a little bit better when I still lived in the Chicago area, and very intelligent person. Like I said in the show notes to you, he's close to completing a doctorate at the University of Chicago, and I think was kind of an all-star student at Wheaton and that kind of thing. And he's a year or two older than I am.
Is he still religious?
Yeah, as far as I know. Yeah. Okay. And so, we were talking, this might've been like summer of 2019 even, or maybe the fall, but he just touched base with me just as a friend to say like, hey, I know you're going through this difficult, personal thing right now with, the ending of my prior relationship. And I just wonder how you're doing, and if you want to catch up sometime. So I appreciated that. And we set up a phone call and mostly talked of other things, but, toward the end, I was just like, well, on top of all of this, I don't know if you know this, but I've, been non-religious now for some time. And so I'm like, some of the advice he was giving and ways he was framing things were in that context, I think, still assuming that I, was valuing that, or there's, my core belief system. And so I was just trying to help him understand, like, I appreciate it. I know it's well-meaning, but, it's just a bit irrelevant at this point for these reasons. And so it was like a bit of a surprise to him, because again, we weren't super close. So like, he didn't necessarily know this about me. And so like he kind of pivoted, and I brought up a couple, like even just minor points, things we've already touched on, God of the gaps or infinite regress, or, so on and so on. And just some of the scientific arguments against religion. He's like, well, let me stop you there, because I think it's important for you to realize that I think the way he phrased it was, religion has never been about its explanatory power for the natural world and for what goes on in our world and the universe at large. It's always been much more geared toward a system of personhood and a framework by which people can live their lives and live a good life. And that's how, more how you should be phrasing it. And then he did carry on with something that you and I agree on. And I did agree with him in that moment, which was, you're still living your life according to some of these tenets, whether you realize it or not. Like there will be things that you've carried forward and will continue to do so that you might even deny. But I think when you would like reflect in another 5 to 10 years time, you'd still be able to see the trace remains, the half-life of Christianity, like in your life. And I didn't disagree with him on that, but I was just like, well, I have to disagree with you. We didn't get into it heavily, but especially after the call was over, I was just like, that seems like yet again, even for a super capable, intelligent person like him, just like an out, because I'm like, of course the Bible and all these other, sacred texts have taken a huge piece of explanatory power, and at bare minimum, humanity's always treated them as such. So, this is very problematic for me. And, I don't, there's so many inconsistencies, and I'm like, if you're going to just go ahead and say, well, that whole book of Genesis that like kicks off the entire Bible and says how the universe came to be. No, that's not really what it's about. It's about these other things. And I'm like, well, it's just piecemeal yet again, trying to grasp at relevance still, for the Bible and for the system of thinking. So
it just makes me wonder though, like with the, maybe I wouldn't frame things in quite the way that he said it, but, I think there is something to the idea that the explanatory element of religion is in some respects a kind of afterthought and justification. Like, for most people, right, you start, and this is true of thinking in general, whether we're talking about religious or secular, even people in the sciences. Like, Kuhn in Structure of Scientific Revolutions, like, talks about essentially the same thing. You start with an emotional position first, and you build an edifice around these emotions, right? This is true of everybody and everything as far as I'm concerned. Now, that doesn't mean that you will necessarily, always end up with like, an irrational set of like, beliefs or whatever. But since that impetus is there, you then have to wonder, like, well, why does it seem like, human beings who are so kind of like fine-tuned for intelligence, why do we like have this kind of like emotional bias? And like, they sort of, did experiments on this. And if you take away the emotional aspect of thinking, right, the emotional side of thinking, you actually also collapse and completely lose the intellectual side. If you eliminate emotions and that kind of impetus from the beginning, you find yourself in a situation where, for example, you can't decide between like, a set of like, evenly distributed or evenly weighted elements, right? Let's say like you're trying to like adjudicate whether something is right or wrong, and you have like some evidence here and some evidence there. If you eliminate your like if you could go into your brain and like shut off like the emotional valve in some way, you're not going to be able to weigh those options anymore. And you see all the time, like in the way that people like do, all kinds of like ad hoc reasoning, that emotion it always plays a very kind of central role. Like, people have to be like, honest with themselves. Like, how willing are you to budge from positions that you like? I definitely catch myself all the time, doing things that are more emotional than not, and they seem so intellectual, like from the kind of like from a different vantage point. But I know that's not actually what's happening. Religion was in fact progressive, right? Just like capitalism, I still believe that in America, capitalism could be progressive because at minimum we haven't even yet gotten to the stage of like, Norway or whatever. Like we're not even a social democratic regime yet, much less, a truly progressive capitalist regime. So same thing with religion. Like Nietzsche said it himself. He was like, religious wars are actually, I think this is in Gay Science, religious wars are a positive development in human history, not a negative one. And this is someone that hated religion. And nonetheless, like he was rational about this. He said, religious wars are a positive development for humanity because with a religious war, you have proof that human beings are taking ideas seriously, right? Now, you don't have to simply fight about material interests. You could say there is something big here that we could latch onto. It could gel us. Maybe it could, create a war, but we are taking these abstractions seriously.
Yeah. So I think a lot of what you say there is on point and interesting. Your comment from Nietzsche in particular, I hadn't heard before. So I think that's pretty fascinating. But I suppose from times past, the interwoven nature of religion as explanatory plus religion as moral code, it is difficult to have any kind of real problem with. Quote unquote, because people just didn't know better. We didn't have enough of a communal knowledge set to be able to really handle these things yet. And of course, any time that someone either came up with a theory at minimum, or then made an effort to really expand the bounds of knowledge, it was met with all kinds of persecution, which, as a modern person is frustrating when you think back to what these people would have gone through simply by asking questions and coming up with a couple other ideas. It can even get maddening to think about. I think in the modern day where that still goes on en masse is where I get, quite frustrated about it and say, well, okay, even if you're going to tell me that according to the most rigorous thinking possible in whatever institutions or circles of thought. Religion is as explanatory power is officially on the out, and we're all just here studying it for these other virtues and these other reasons. Okay, fine, but like you cannot necessarily, though, in the real world separate that, because it has impact on huge numbers of human lives and and the course of events that happen. And most of the world, of course, is not, scholars sitting around a table deciding it's okay to just, at this point, discard explanatory power. That's fine. We'll cast it out. Yeah. But what we're keeping, though, is the moral code. And so let's figure out how to refine that and make it work. That's just not how most people are approaching it. It's definitely it's a double deal in terms of how that goes. So it just, to me, it seemed like kind of disingenuous and just a way to like keep the machine rolling.
Yeah.
And like still not really deal with real world outcomes of what goes on. So
that seems to be the emotional impetus for what your friend told you, right? Like, so that's just, again, like, this is how thoughts begin. This is how cogitation begins. And again, like, like religion, like I think the best way it's like to think of it is nation states are objectively better than tribes, right? That's just a fact, right? And the reason why it's a fact is what you can leverage in a nation state in terms of like human power, human capital is just much better and higher and impressive and stronger. You could do much more, right, with that kind of leverage. But how can you leverage the power of a nation state before you can materially get to a nation state, right? The answer is religion, right? Like before you could have a formal nation state, you at least could have a religion. One thing I'll say about what we just talked about, like all that by way of introduction, it might seem kind of excessive to some people, I guess, but it's what we do. First of all, and second of all, it is actually relevant in the sense that the book of Ecclesiastes, like in terms of like sublimation, I think it applies because like God very much feels like an afterthought in Ecclesiastes. Like it definitely feels like it was tacked on. I had the sense of this, like when I first read it, when I reread it, then when I was actually doing research for this, it turns out that many of the kind of like more explicit mentions of God, they were actually tacked in by like, religious scholars after the book was written, I guess, in a more kind of secular light, because for so many parts of the book, and maybe, I'm not sure if you have the same sense, but for many parts of the book, it feels as if God kind of appears as a kind of a needless explanation, right? You have this emphasis on labor, right? Like you have to commit to doing good work, whatever that is, for the rest of your life. And as that happens, you wonder maybe sometimes like, is it all for naught? And God sort of appears like this kind of like, Deus ex machina, kind of like, well, yeah, it was all worth it because, and there's God. But there are some answers in the book that are more satisfying than that. Like it like answers that sort of make God redundant. I'm not sure if you want to give any impressions of the book first, or maybe we could just get into reading the entirety of the first chapter so that any viewers who might not have ever read this thing could at least get a sense of what it's like, right? And why I would be interested in this book and why, it's an actual example of good writing.
Sure. So I think you sum up a couple important things well right there. I agree. From the first time I ever read Ecclesiastes in any kind of meaningful way, probably as a teenager, it does stick out, from the rest of the Bible, mostly for just that, the attitude and the sentiments expressed. I think it might be helpful for some people to know that it does appear in these 4 consecutive books in the Old Testament that kind of act as a little bit of a bridge, in my opinion, thematically, where you have like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all these like really, kind of like both explanatory and then also like law giving books that kick off the Old Testament. It kind of keeps moving in that vein. There's a lot of history of the Jewish people. There's some perspective from different people thrown in. But then you get to Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and that 4-pack right there is a much more literary turn that the Old Testament takes. And in Psalms and Proverbs, much more so than Ecclesiastes, God is treated, much more as a personal God, someone that is close by you, someone that is watching over you, someone that should be obeyed and feared, but also can give love and receive love, this kind of thing. And then you hit Ecclesiastes, and it just takes this really interesting turn where it's existential. And like you said, God feels tacked on, and the writer is just asking these questions more from a pure thought standpoint, almost of what is going on? Or I should even say, I mean, questions are sort of asked both directly and indirectly throughout, but it's a little bit more declamatory with all these, all this vanity and vexation of spirit, and the, any listeners and watchers will see that very immediately when you read the first chapter. But at any rate, it just it comes with this interesting moment. Then Song of Songs or Song of Solomon right after it is like directed toward a human lover. Mm-hmm. Some people extrapolate that to be some kind of love between the author and God, but I think it's pretty clear it's more human based. So anyway, it just comes at an interesting turn. And then after that, the Old Testament gets into more like prophetic books that start to hint at the coming of the Messiah and these kind of things. So it's a standout within a bridge of books that kind of stand out anyway, and really kind of an interesting read unto itself.
And it was, traditionally it was said that this was written by King Solomon, right? That's not accepted anymore. Interestingly, no. in my edition, I have a King James Bible that's kind of like, it's a literary Bible in the sense that there's tons of glosses, there's tons of explanatory information. From what I recall, I think it just assumes that Solomon was the writer and just kind of takes that for granted. But that part has been rejected. But when you're reading it, you sort of understand why. Like if you're trying to establish a tradition, well, why would you say that Solomon is the one that wrote this book, right? Well, it fits into the themes of Solomon is a wise king and also an extremely wealthy king, right? And he talks about the speaker talks about his acquiring of wealth and how that was just kind of fruitless in a sense, and also wisdom being fruitless in another sense, which is kind of interesting. But like I said, I just want to read the first chapter here so that people get a sense of what this book is actually like. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor, which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also ariseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. The wind goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north. It whirleth about continually, and the wind returneth again according to his circuits. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers come, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come, with those that shall come after. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. This sore travail hath God given me to the sons of man to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. I communed with mine own heart, saying, Lo, I am come to great estate, and have gotten more wisdom than all they that have been before me in Jerusalem. Yeah, my heart had great experience of wisdom and knowledge, and I gave my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this is also vexation of spirit. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow. And that is how it ends. Just like I guess preliminary impressions. You start getting these kinds of like initial tensions like near the end, right? He's saying that not only is labor vanity, the creation of works, but so is wisdom, right? So is wealth. But as you pointed out, well, if he believes that wisdom is vanity and in a sense even perhaps like a kind of folly if overdone, what is he doing exactly imparting this? If all is vanity, including labor, why are you imparting this book, right? What is the point of engaging in such if you believe that it's ultimately going to come to nothing? Just this idea of just kind of like poo-pooing wisdom, it makes you wonder, like, is this exactly like where God is supposed to be tacked in? Like, is this supposed to be a comment on, human wisdom is somehow insufficient, but God's wisdom is sort of eternal? Like, what exactly is being said there? I'm not sure if you have any responses to the overall chapter or anything that I just said.
Yeah, so our thoughts when we were exchanging notes, I think were fairly similar on this, and that was upon rereading it, and I'm sure we both read it a few times prepping for this. So each time I would reread it, that does stand out as this paradox where even if you're going to say that everything in life is vanity and it's meaningless, and even wisdom falls into that category and labor falls into that category, well, the author here is laboring to write things down that would be presumably passed on as wisdom. So it's almost a little bit funny even in a sense, but that is one of the other main questions then that arises is, okay, so is he just considering that whatever level of wisdom he has attained is what's meaningless, and that no human can get to a point where they've gained enough wisdom for it to be meaningful? Or is even God's wisdom, any kind of wisdom, just fruitless in the end? And it's interesting that the author would even make these kinds of statements because, I suppose when I was young and reading the Bible, and even to this day, if I were to read it, I would be assuming that I am, it's the word of God, right? So anything that I'm reading should be a portion of God's spoken wisdom unto people, and therefore, if I'm going to make myself a follower of this particular set of beliefs and these words in this scripture, that it is meaningful. So it, again, like you said, it sets up these interesting tensions and paradoxes. Just another, because we're going to be examining this also just as, the quality of the writing and an artwork, those first several verses in particular, like verses 3-7 stood out to me as kind of like Robinson Jeffers-esque a little bit, where there's like these grand sweeping statements about the earth and the sun and nature, coming and going. It ariseth, it hasteth the place it arose, it whirleth, it returneth unto its circuits. all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Like I don't know, it just has this like very grand kind of posturing about it. And it is beautiful language, you know.
In contrast, like specifically when you said Robinson Jeffers-esque, I didn't just take it in terms of like the language, although like the language is, you know, is Jeffers-esque, but also like in terms of the content, like this is being set up in contrast to how minuscule people are, right? And, you know, a constant theme throughout the poetry of Robinson Jeffers is, you know, we are kind of like the, you know, these like bits of nothingness, you know, in this like far, you know, wider matrix. And not only bits of nothingness, but also ones that have like, you know, all these preoccupations, all these like subjective feelings and desires that ultimately don't matter. Like in his poem, Joy is Not Great, where, you know, he talks about, you know, sorrow, he talks about happiness, and you know, he says like we could sort of, you know, perhaps like adjudicate which one of these things is better, but they're not really great in and of themselves, right? Like, you know, joy is nice and sorrow isn't all that good, but peace is what's really great. You know, labor is what's really great. The fact that the planet and the universe endures with or without you is an example of greatness. So you know, I'm not sure if you made the connection or if you had any other reasons for calling it Jeffers-esque.
That's exactly right. Okay. Yeah. So you know, obviously in my comments there a minute ago, I was speaking to the language directly, but yes, the arguments that are built and the sentiments expressed, absolutely. You know, it gave me the same feeling in line of thought after, you know, those initial feelings as reading quite a bit of Jeffers' work over time on those same themes and ideas. And it's even worth noting, I mean, Jeffers grew up religious as well, from what I recall of his biography. So he may well have been influenced by something like this.
Yeah. And it's just interesting how like some of the early lines, like they really do kind of like structurally and thematically prefigure what, you know, what's going to come. Like, for example, in verse 7, all the rivers, verse 8, all things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. You could interpret that in different ways, but I think the way that is sort of most kind of like relevant to what comes later in the book is, you know, you could like engage in all of these like human works until death, but you know, can you really be satisfied with the outcome? Is there ever going to be a time when you say enough, right? Like, is enough supposed to come? Just like, is the demarcation supposed to come like with death? Like, is that the boundary, right? Like when you die, that's enough, right? And until then, you work and work and work until you cannot. You take in as much as you can into your ear. You take in as much as you can into your eye. Like in our case, of course, like it's, you know, it's engaging in with music or, you know, with art, with, you know, with writing. For somebody else, it might be something else. But there's this constantly the sense of whatever you do, it will ultimately not be enough, right? And I think it's an interesting and open question as to how the book might define enough and how we, you know, would define enough today. How can you define enough philosophically? You know, is it true as Shelley Kagan argues that you know, you don't really have options in life, and options are simply a bullshit excuse to sort of live an easier life, right? It is enough truly demarcated by death. And you know that's something that the author returns to again and again, and it is always like ambiguous, right? There isn't ever truly an answer given, right? Which honestly, I think in the way that this book pans out, it's probably all for the best, you know, in some senses.
Yeah, the lack of resolution by the end, we'll talk about the tacked on way in which some other writers attempted to kind of resolve all of this at the very end of the book. But the open-ended nature of it, and the prodding and question asking is again, it is also a unique treatment in the Bible to not give complete answers and have God be that complete answer essentially every time. So it does set up for a continued build on some of this ambiguity, but these same themes as we go along. So do we want to jump onto some additional thoughts and any other excerpts we highlighted?
Maybe not in the first book, but like the first chapter. But in the second chapter, I don't have any highlighted lines, but what I found interesting in the second chapter is, so like in the second chapter, this is where let's call him the Solomon character, kind of, so he set, the first chapter, he sort of sets things up by saying that, hey, I engage in all this work. I procured so much wealth. I, did so many things, right? I created physical objects, and all is vanity. In the second chapter, he actually starts to go over specifically what he did to reach these conclusions.
Right.
And what struck me as interesting is, when he starts to detail the things that he engaged in, they didn't strike me as very, like in no sense is enduring, I guess, in the modern sense. And it made me wonder, like, is he skeptical of, the endurance of like human objects and human ideas and human labor, simply because he, perhaps engaged in the wrong kind of, set of actions? Like he talks about, for example, the acquisition of wealth. We know we could, we don't have to argue about this, right? The acquisition of wealth in and of itself, especially if it doesn't lead to anything deep, like that is a kind of like a folly, right? That is the wrong pursuit in almost all scenarios. But then he starts to talk about what we might still broadly call the arts, but back then was absolutely intertwined with the arts. It was art, right? So he talks about constructing, massive homes, right? He talks about, the construction of temples, I think, at some point. He talks about, getting all of these, like, perhaps well-known popular singers into one room, and they're all singing together. If one of his labors was, like, again, let's assume the King Solomon character, if one of his labors in fact was, I'm going to sort of engage in this kind of biblical wisdom tradition, and I'm going to write this book, and this is what I will impart to the world, right? This is what I'm communicating. It seems like it sort of stood the test of time, when in fact, what he was doing during his life, it wasn't really firm to begin with.
I know exactly what you mean. And so that absolutely stood out as well. I think we both mentioned something about this, in our notes that we were exchanging, where the irony of the whole thing is that he did build something that lasted, which is this writing. And so, whether he was in any way aware of that and some kind of like great self-satirist before there was such a thing, who I think we probably have to say that wasn't the case. And he was just out in the world with, immeasurable wealth and power, kind of trying to see, can I put any of this to good use and to productive use that will bring me some kind of satisfaction? He doesn't even speak really of, unless I'm wrong, correct me, but anything where he's talking about this being for like society or the greater good. He's literally just like,
it's almost like self-satisfaction, right? It's almost like boredom, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's just kind of dart tossing his wealth and his power and influence at, like, could this make me happy? Could this bring me satisfaction? What about that? And none of them really do, according to him. And so, the funny thing being that we're able to kind of be here today, 2,000 years later or whatever, breaking this down and getting something out of it in the end. But I certainly agree. It's kind of this age-old problem of like, what can you do during your life that really has some kind of impact and lasting meaning? Mm-hmm. And I think it's also worth saying, we're maybe going to touch on this in a little bit here anyway, so I'll bring it up now. Like, an awful lot of, at least from what I remember, and especially in like less, what would you say, like less theologically dense and intense sermons over time that you hear in church will pull, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes get pulled from all the time in terms of like wisdom dropping to the masses that are attending, right? And so, I can't even tell you how many times over the years I would hear verses from this book, even ones we've already read, that are then summed up by a preacher to be said, so guys, obviously in the end, do everything for God, because if you just become a business person or a doctor or a whatever, and you go out there and try your very best and do as well as you possibly can, it's still not going to really mean anything unless you have Jesus in your heart or whatever, however they were like trying to package it. But never one time was there a discussion of, is he in any way being disingenuous here? Is he pursuing things that actually do have true worth? What would that look like if he did? And can we do that? So, it sets up for some more things that'll come here later in the book, but it's interesting because, it's not as if that the authors of the book at the time could have known this, but, here we are thousands of years later, we have a more kind of comprehensive understanding of what art is, right? Right. We could say that, hey, he's sort of like talking about wisdom in this kind of, somewhat negative light. But we also have chapter 2, and chapter 2 tells us it gives us clues as to why he might feel this way, that he did essentially just, toss darts, right? He uses wealth for the sake of self-satisfaction, right? He engaged in these like more limited forms of art for personal reasons, as opposed to really leaving something behind. And chapter 2, like in that sense, like it gives you a clue for so much else, right? Like it also explains, like we said, it's ambiguous in terms of, well, what does enough mean? And also, what does wisdom mean? Are we talking about, wisdom is folly, period? Is it specifically human wisdom? Is it like a more kind of transcendental wisdom that is also folly? Because, if you're the Solomon character here, and you don't, you can't see past your age, right? Like back then, the construction of these homes or these temples or whatever, that was perhaps the extent of art. And if you're saying that wisdom is folly in some senses, all you're saying is, I'm a human being, right, of my specific era. These are the limits of what I know. Whatever wisdom that I'll impart is going to be in some way tentative, right? Someone else is going to have to adjudicate some of these things. And in chapter 2, like we're able to adjudicate things here that no writer, right, 2,000, 2,500 years ago would have been able to adjudicate. Right. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And certainly we can't expect the Solomon character author necessarily to have totally transcended his time and his surrounds to say, I'm about to bring you great poetry that will last, well beyond me. This is the one thing that you can put wisdom toward that will have value. I mean, the amount of insight that would have been needed at that time just pretty much would have been impossible to have. Yeah. So it can't be too hard on him from that standpoint, but certainly maybe that intuition of still deciding to write all of this down, did help him out. And you're right. We can, now that we've had so much continued progress in the arts, we're able to sit here today and talk about this in that context. And, hopefully you'd say that another 1,000 to 2,000 years from now, there might be people, watching our video here that are, talking about certain insights we had and then things we missed, and it just continues on in that way. So, yeah, definitely agree. I do want to read just a couple quick verses from chapter 2, and then maybe we can move on, because in addition to some of the tension setting that we talked about in chapter 1, right within a few lines of each other in chapter 2, there are some contradictions that also set up this feeling of uncertainty, and whether we can really, in some ways, even trust the author about this whole wisdom folly conundrum. So it says here, chapter 2, verse 13, "Then I saw that wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness." And he continues on, "The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walketh in darkness. And I myself perceived also that one event happeneth to them all. Then I said in my heart, as it happeneth to the fool, so it happeneth even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For there is no remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever, seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And how dieth the wise man? As the fool." So again, within a few lines, he goes from, well, I saw that wisdom was better than folly, to, well, maybe not, because the same end comes to everyone.
Yeah.
And I think you and I would agree more with the first statement than the latter one. It's certainly better to be wise and try to make something of that wisdom, but just interesting.
It's
contradictions.
Yeah. Like if you look at verse 15, it ends with, like, what happens to the fool, so it happens even to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart that this also is vanity. I get the sense that if you would have like omitted verse 16, for there is, which is kind of like the explanation of that final line in verse 15, that would have given it a much more kind of open-ended feeling of, the thought that, well, if it happens to him and it happens to me also, how am I more wise? That is also a vain thought, right? Because the vanity there in thinking that, as it happeneth to me, it happeneth to the fool. The vanity there is in thinking, well, simply because I have this additional wisdom, I can either avoid the worst of life, or I can, or I deserve to somehow avoid, or God should have like provided me some kind of out, right? That he did, and that is obviously a very vain thought, right? That is the vanity. But instead, there's this kind of explanation after the fact. For there's no more remembrance of the wise more than of the fool forever. Seeing that which now is in the days to come shall all be forgotten. And 17 is also interesting. Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexations of spirit. And if you truly do believe that nothing that you're doing is in fact a true benefit to society, well, undertaking that labor then by definition is grievous to you, right? Like it's hurting you, right? It means that you're expending energy unnecessarily, right? And that's enough. Here, you're undertaking things that you don't even know why you're doing it. And if you truly believe that there is nothing after me in some regards, then why not? Then why shouldn't you think that way?
Mm-hmm. Right. And even verse 18, as he continues on, "Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me." I don't know how you interpreted that, but for my part, it's kind of this concern about leaving a legacy to a potential fool who might ruin anything you've even worked to build. And I was also just thinking again of some of the things we talked about in ArtiFact number 1, where during your lifetime, whatever thing you are capable of doing, you must build and you must work on it, but you really can't know what's going to come next in your own life, let alone the next lives and generations after you, and whether anyone ever will or when they will arrive to build upon whatever you worked on. But we still do it anyway. But here he's expressing this this feeling of, why even bother? Because I have no guarantees that it's not really working out for me. I'm not deriving much value and worth from it, and I might even leave it to someone who would be stupider than me. So why do it at all? Again, just a really interesting sentiment for the Bible as well. I hated life. There's nowhere else in the whole Bible that I recall where a line like that happens. So
yeah. If you have anything else to say about chapter 2, go ahead.
No, that's it.
I have lines from 3. We sort of, I think we highlighted different lines. I highlighted actually everything from 9 to 22. So I'm going to read that out as well. Let's see. So what profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboreth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. Wait, is this it? Oh, no, yeah, sorry.
Okay. That's it.
So I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set the world in their heart, so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. I know that there is no good in them, but for a man to rejoice and to do good in his life. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. That which hath been is now. That which is to be hath already been. And God requireth that which is past. And moreover, I saw under the sun the place of judgment, that wickedness was there, and the place of righteousness, that iniquity was there. I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts, even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast, for all is vanity. And go unto one place. All are of the dust, and all turn to dust again. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward from the earth? Wherefore I perceive that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his portion. For who shall bring him to see what shall be after him? And when I read this, the reason why I wanted to read the entire set of passages here is like all those feelings that God was sort of tacked on. I think this really comes to the fore at this point, right? Here he has like all the good reasons for sort of enjoying your labor, for making that your kind of like life's goal. But despite that, there, he still feels the need to sort of drag in God. And, my question is, why, right? Like there's this kind of like, it's almost as if like God is like a stand-in as a concept for other things. Like, there's this like reassurance that God will correct the world's evils. Like if not now, then, maybe like during some kind of abstract later. But there's also this like, he's also like assuming that there's this like terrestrial obligation for man to enjoy the fruits of his labor. And if in fact there is a terrestrial obligation to enjoy the fruit of your labor, what is the point of bringing God into the equation, right? Like it's sort of like, God is a very kind of useful stepping stone for certain things, perhaps. But, even by the time that we get to the Bible here, right? Even here, this is supposed to be, a religious text. We have a secular explanation for why life is the way that it is and for what you need to get out of life, right? And that secular explanation, it just strikes me as sufficient. But by the very words, like within the passages, like you don't need to bring in or to, in this case, sort of like sneak in, because that's literally what did happen, right? You don't need to sneak in the concept of God, because you have all these stand-ins for God that you've already enumerated in your own book.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is really the first, major time here in the entire book that we start to get this just, pin dropping of, we'll put God in there, stick it in there, that can maybe, and who knows? I mean, maybe it was to give some comfort to readers of that time. If, we've talked about how certain parts, later writers came back and put this concept of God in, or maybe accentuated it. But you have to assume at least a few times he would have mentioned God and put it in there. So you're just wondering, is this to pander a little bit? Is it to give people a little bit of hope in the midst of this otherwise bleak set of tenets that he's outlining here? And why do that? I mean, if you're going to have the bulk of the book by far really be about other things, it is still a curious choice.
Yeah. Anything else from chapter 3?
No, that's it from chapter 3. I mean, other than just you started in the middle of it, the very beginning verses of that chapter are some of the most famous.
Oh, that's why I skipped them
from the whole book. So
sorry. Yeah, the most famous verses I skipped because it's like, you've probably already heard them. Well, whatever. Let's read them. You know what? We're just going to read the whole book, aren't we? We're gonna read the whole fucking book.
Man, that'd be beastly. I don't know, but I was just going to say, if any folks watching, have already read the book or are going to read it, you're certain to recognize some of those lines because they've been directly pulled and reappropriated by other artworks.
And just quickly, it's stuff like a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. And that's kind of like the first half. And it may be kind of unfair, but I've heard it so many times that I just didn't feel the need to rehash that.
No. It's pretty cliche at this point.
Yeah.
I would say, that whole part has descended into cliche as it's been just constantly remixed over time. But anyway, they're well-known verses that pretty much everybody has heard in their life in some way. You want to move on to chapter 5?
Yeah, I have a couple of lines. Do you want to start with what you have written down and maybe we could sort of take it from there?
Sure. So chapter 5, verse 2, we've got another Ecclesiastes classic. I'll read it quick. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore let thy words be few. So that one there is a typical colloquial wisdom thing passed around. And that verse is, again, one of the more quoted I can ever remember, probably from my childhood, and almost a justification in a way by Christian thinkers for some of the things we talked about earlier. A little bit of that God of the gaps thing, where it's just, if you don't know, then just don't talk about anything. Don't even attempt. Just God's up there. He has it under control. He has it figured out. You don't. Whatever wisdom you might attain is lesser. So just don't talk. And I think, as time goes by, more and more people would say you have to disagree with that. Then in verse 8 and verse 19, those are the other two main ones I highlighted here. There's this really odd sort of advice giving. So in chapter 5, verse 8, if thou seest the oppression of the poor and violent perverting of judgment and justice in a province, marvel not at the matter. For he that is higher than the highest regardeth, and there be higher than they. So in a subtle way, first of all, don't be surprised at this. Marvel not at the matter, which I think we could all probably say that that's generally true, and no one's too surprised that these things happen. But a little bit of an insinuation to just shrug it off, and whoever's up on high will go ahead and take care of this. And some of those sentiments are echoed again later on in the book, which I think is just odd advice, but maybe not for a king at that time who considers themselves to have the capacity to rule and to judge, or if they can't, God will, kind of thing. But for the common person, we all, I think, have this sense that whether we exercise it or not, that you can see corruption, you can see these things happen, and you really should be calling it out when you see it, rather than just assuming it'll get resolved by someone else.
Yeah, in the vicinity of these lines, when we talked about, let me just read both of them then, because I had an additional line at the top of what you had. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore, let thy words be few. The follow-up it's kind of like explanatory. For a dream cometh through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by multitude of words. And when we think about how Judaism must have emerged, right? One of the traditions was probably a little bit of a Greek tradition, was kind of added in after the fact. And, this sentiment strikes me as very Greek. When people think of the classic, Greek admonition to know thyself, most people seem to interpret it as you have to really get to know your mind. You have to know where you sort of who you are, perhaps where you fit in the world. But the original admonition is much more a kind of caution against hubris, right? Know thyself in the sense that know who you are, with the knowledge that there is such a thing as, the gods, right? Know who you are because you are not the gods. And here it's the same kind of admonition. Later in the chapter, the reason why I guess I wrote these down is it's interesting because you sort of see how some of the thoughts that writers from 2,500 years ago, they might have had thoughts that were just kind of they're getting at an idea, but they might not necessarily know why that idea is, or they might not be able to fully explain it. And then afterwards, we're able to do better in that front. So when it starts to discuss wealth, starting from verse 10, chapter 5, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, nor he that loveth abundance with increase. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they are increased that eat them. And what good is there to the owners thereof, saving the beholding of them with their eyes? The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son, and there is nothing in his hand. A fairly scary set of lines. It sort of reminds me of the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eat little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not suffer him to sleep. There's always this, with wealth, there's always going to be this fear of loss. And there's this one really nice anthology of Stoic writing across the years. It starts with the classical Stoics, but it moves into the more kind of modern day. And they had a passage from Schopenhauer that very much reminded me of this idea of a loss, right? Like if you have something, you're always going to, fear loss, and you're also going to feel like, nothing is ever enough, right? When it says like, he that loveth silver shall not be satisfied with silver, right? He that loves abundance will increase. So Schopenhauer in The Wisdom of Life, this is the way that he frames it, right? So he gives an actual explanation for what in Ecclesiastes is sort of like just kind of hinted at. And his explanation for this phenomenon is as follows. There is no absolute or definite amount of wealth which will satisfy a man. The amount is always relative. That is to say, just so much as will maintain the proportion between what he wants and what he gets. For to measure a man's happiness by what he gets, and not also by what he expects to get, is as futile as to try and express a fraction which shall have a numerator but no denominator. Right? It's a great passage, and yeah, he's able to explain thousands of years after the fact what has always been known, right? People have always suspected that. You see this in Buddhism, right? There's always the sense that, enough is never enough. Here's the explanation for why that is.
Yeah. So I think that definitely those lines stand out as you go along. And this is someone who is speaking from experience with this thing as well, having attained great wealth and still considering it folly. And so, yeah, the Schopenhauer quote is excellent. Definitely does a great job of summing up those sentiments. And in a way, it also probably ties back to these bigger questions of just what constitutes wisdom in general, and whether a wealthy person could be wise enough to know when they've reached, quote, enough. And if that's even possible for somebody, or if they will just inevitably continue on and perpetuate this cycle and remain unhappy or unfulfilled or unwise, or however you want to put it, because they don't have the capacity to do this reflection and to think about it. Yeah. So.
Let's see. Do you have anything for chapter 6? Because I don't have anything for that.
No, we can skip over chapter 6.
What about 7? If you have anything there. Otherwise, I have some things I want to discuss.
Okay. Yeah. So the main thing I wanted to highlight from chapter 7 just is a piece, one verse that I consider really good writing in general. It's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite metaphor from the entire book. So chapter 7, verse 6, for as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. So I just really enjoyed that image. It's stark and kind of interesting. I'm guessing there might be some kind of ancient Hebrew bit of like imagery there, the crackling of thorns under a pot. I just thought that was an interesting image and phrase. And then to equate that to the laughter of a fool just stood out to me as a nice little bit of writing there.
Yeah. In my, I have like a kind of like, one of these, like, it's like a study Bible with like tons of notes. They're just saying that crackling is a literary version of the word sound, which just, it's not very helpful. I mean, obviously, right? Like, yeah, you don't want to say sound of thorns. You could say crackling, right? Because it's more, I guess, expressive and descriptive.
Right.
Yeah. What else I have here? For 7. Oh, there is also like that there's like a return of some of the mystery and ambiguity here. All things have I seen, verse 15, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? And I just find that very interesting because, well, first of all, there's this kind of, it's the Bible, right? And the Bible is admonishing you to like not be righteous. And we talked about this in ArtiFact number 1, like there is always this desire to be like very self-righteous. And one thing that I wanted to talk about like earlier when we were discussing like our kind of religious upbringings kind of in general, I get the sense that a lot of my sort of psychological predilections for religion came from like a desire for, gatekeeping essentially, right? Like it felt good to be Christian, didn't it? It felt good to be a gatekeeper in that regard. In the same way that honestly, like it feels good to be like a gatekeeper of the arts. It feels good thinking that I have this sort of, arcane kind of knowledge when it comes to like defining art appropriately, knowing how to differentiate good from bad, right? Like that's very satisfying, right? So this desire to gatekeep, which is kind of everywhere and pretty much in everything. Is that the being overly righteous? Is it simply the fact that as we said earlier about this book, that any one person is always limited by their age, right? By where they were born, right? What time period they were born in. Like any wisdom, even if it's like supreme wisdom, is going to be limited in that regard. So there's always a danger in being too righteous. There's a danger in miscalculating whether or not you could even get people on board for this kind of like army that you're trying to recruit for whatever cause, secular or religious, that you're trying to get on your side. Like, is that the admonition? Because it's just interesting to hear something about being overly righteous, in the context of the Bible, given that the Bible gives you so much ammunition for being righteous, right? To the point of like in some cases like genocide, to the point of God justifying all manner of grisly occurrences, in the kind of like, I guess, mythology of the Bible. But, like also like neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself, right? There is, there is this kind of danger there in the same way that, there's a man here that prolongeth his life in his wickedness, right? Evil can very easily have this kind of effect where it increases your lifespan, right? If you're willing to be an evil person, you have a kind of like competitive edge, don't you? Right? Because most people are not willing to be evil. Those that are, they have a competitive edge in this kind of, marketplace of organisms.
Yeah, no question. And the whole self-righteousness idea in excess does come back around in the Bible. For anyone who's not familiar, Jesus gives a lot of retorts to people during the books where he's present in the Bible, to anyone who thinks that they've got more of a sense really to the tune of how righteous to be, and that they are the gatekeepers of those things, people like the Pharisees in the New Testament, and gives these kind of these pushbacks. So we find that here too, but it is still, especially in the Old Testament, an odd sentiment and thing to hear when for the most part everything else is geared toward maximal righteousness, maximal rightness with God, and everything else.
Yeah.
I was looking at some of these other verses in 7 just to see if there's anything else that I had but I think a lot of it does start to get into a bit of rehash of some earlier ideas. And I felt the same way about 8. I didn't have any really notable notes on 8. I've got some things on 9, but I
have, oh, no. 8 is just number 8 in terms of the listing. Yeah. I'm going into 9.
Okay.
From that point on. You want to start with 9?
Sure. So one of the things I highlighted is in chapter 9, verse 10, this is what it says: "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might. For there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave, whither thou goest." So to me, this represented a little bit of a turning from some of the earlier sentiments. All of a sudden now there's this command or this encouragement to find what you can do and do it as mightily as possible. And I think that's a sentiment you and I would both agree with. You can't do anything when you're dead, and you're going to be dead a really long time. So relating back again to some of the things we talked about in ArtiFact number 1 and self-actualization and purpose, it's kind of, that verse to me is a little bit of a breath of fresh air almost, because it comes after some pretty heavy in chapter 7 and 8, just continued listing of how many things are worthless and meaningless in his existence here. But this one stands out. And then in verse 11, immediately following that, there's also this interesting sentiment. So this is verse 11: "I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all." So again, really, really interesting. There's just nothing else quite like this that I recall from the Bible, where that final bit of words there, "but time and chance happeneth to them all," again, almost just kind of cutting God out of the equation. And there's no mention there of God's will be done in your life. You can try your best, strive your utmost, and hopefully something good comes of it. But in the end, don't worry, because God has your back anyway, and he'll save you and take you on, et cetera, et cetera. There's just this tidy little, hey, don't get too wrapped up in anything that's going on, because luck might just beat you. And that's such a unique sentiment, to kind of express that maybe God can't just control and orchestrate absolutely everything. Perhaps blind chance has a role to play.
It's also like a critique of, like, even people that think that they're like smart or wise in some way. Like, I get the sense of so many people, they just like eventually just like collapse into this fucking like bland mush of like popularity contest. You know what I mean? When in reality, the race is not to the swift, right? Like, the battle is not to the strong, right? This is like you will not necessarily be compensated for the good that you do. In fact, in many cases, you will be punished for the good that you do. That's just reality. Yeah. And what is popular, in most cases, with the exception of, like, I guess, certain situations and edge cases and like biological imperatives that make it so, what is popular is really not a good indication of anything at all. Like, what is popular is simply an indication of what can allow things to sort of run in a generic sense, like smoothly. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So again, just highlighting for listeners and watchers, good little bits of writing. So chapter 10, verse 1, with an interesting image here: "Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor. So doth a little folly him that is in reputation for wisdom and honor." So in a way, almost like a cliched sentiment, like don't sour your reputation, your lifelong reputation, with a minute or two of indiscretion, which is something we've all heard plenty of times. But that opening of that line, "Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary to send forth a stinking savor," is is a nice little poetic line there. So that was the main thing I had highlighted from 10. I think, again, a lot of rehashing of some of the earlier bits. Even verse 20 has some kind of odd advice about like not cursing the king or the rich in public or in private, because birds will come and chirp it to the air. Something to that effect. For a bird of the air shall carry the voice, and that which hath wings shall tell the matter. So just another expression of this whole sentiment. Like, don't use your voice to say anything, and let nature or God or whoever sort it out.
Yeah, I would at least hope to interpret the opening verse there in chapter 10 as a kind of not even so much like I can't even tell if it's a prescriptive judgment. Like, is it telling you, like, don't in fact sully your reputation with a moment of indiscretion, or is it simply a description of how things are? Because that is how things are, right? Like, if you do something that's like out of either the norm for yourself or just kind of a bad, like, that could so easily overtake people's conceptions of who you really are. And, I just find that kind of toxic. There's this kind of, and you see this especially now, right? In the modern world, you see this in the fucking like Twitter universe where, like, essentially there's this tension between telling people, there is such a thing as propriety in behavior. There is such a thing as good and bad. No, it's not just all morally relative. But if in fact you have ever engaged in this kind of behavior, we're going to completely throw you out. There is no redemption, right? There is no forgiveness. But, I would hope that this is just like a descriptive verse, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I hadn't read it that way initially, but I can agree with you there. Yeah, go ahead with 11, because I didn't have much written down for 11.
Yeah, it's just two verses, 9 and 10. Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Therefore, remove sorrow from thy heart, and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. I kind of found it hard to interpret this a little bit, because, at the beginning, sorrow is treated with respect. In the Jeffers poem, Joy, he says, joy is not great, right? Sorrow is, joy is better than sorrow. Here, there's a sense that sorrow is in fact objectively good, right? Same thing with the Countee Cullen poem that ends, for wisdom cometh with the years, the barren days come too. I think that's what it is. Mm-hmm. I think for wisdom cometh with the years, the barren days come too. Maybe slightly different, but it's something like that. Sorrow, like if you think of like all the kinds of emotions that you feel, if you must feel emotions deeply, sorrow has a kind of like, with the exception of like, crippling depression or something, sorrow has a kind of revitalizing kind of feel, right? It gives you first like time to just mope and conserve energy, and then it gives you an opportunity to say, I don't want to feel this way, so what can I do to avert this? And wisdom provides this, because wisdom gives you a sense of what life is really like, and what life is really like is very different from the images that you would have when you're a child. It's like life never turns out as you expected, obviously, but here sorrow is something to be removed, right? So like you rejoice as a young person in this kind of like, I guess, delusion under the interpretations of the author, but now as an adult, remove sorrow from thy heart. Like how would you like sort of like deal with that kind of disconnect, like from the beginning of the book up to here, and also just like even taking it on its own terms now without even reference to the beginning?
Yeah. So first of all, it definitely is a disconnect, because as you said, and maybe we even read this in one or two of the verses, but in particular, there's a verse earlier on in the book where it says the heart of the wise is in the house of sorrow, mm-hmm. and the heart of the foolish is in the house of mirth, mm-hmm. and goes on in subsequent verses to basically praise the former. So seeing some value in the sorrowful take at times on life. And then, here all of a sudden we have yet another contradiction where it's telling you to remove sorrow in your later years. And, I would, I guess, overall tend to disagree with that. I agree with you that sorrow has this utility and this important role to play, both, I think, in like potent doses in certain times in life when peak negative things might happen to you, commonly called a trough, I guess. Mm-hmm. And then, but also I think in a sense, this sense that like generally having a bit more of a sorrowful disposition and approach to adult life, I do think tends to come along with people, at least in my own life, and you might agree or disagree, but people who tend to be wiser, right? So these more like perpetually optimistic Pollyanna type people that just assume and say to themselves and to others that everything will always work out for the best or whatever. It's like, what does that even mean? What are you talking about? How would that practically come about? There are these issues, these things that we need to address either as individuals or as a collective. And you can't wallow in sorrow all the time, or you'll never take the next step and make an effort to improve that situation. But I think in general, just having a tendency more toward that in your decision making and in your outlook on life probably tends to serve people better, especially as adults. So that's my take on it. So it's an interesting little mm-hmm. passage there.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of this. Maybe you could comment on this. I've always been like a very kind of like a upbeat, optimistic person from like my teenage years onwards, I guess. But as I've hit after I hit 30, I definitely became, in some respects, more sorrowful and melancholy. I'm not sure if this is just like just like peaks, and troubles in life versus something else. Perhaps it's probably what it is. Like, I don't think I've changed too much, but I've always been, despite like being like a pretty happy person, I've always been so moved and attached to like melancholy. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I love like just dark fucking weather. My favorite weather, if it's so cloudy that it's black outside, windy as hell, but no rain, right? Because I want to take a walk. I don't want to be disturbed. I don't want to have extra unnecessary things on my body. But I love that melancholy. When I first got into poetry as a kid, I always gravitated towards the most melancholy poetry. I gravitated towards like kind of like the grimmer poems from Countee Cullen, grimmer poems of like theological poetry more broadly. I loved like, work by Philip Larkin. And I've always wondered why, because, I'm not, I'm a very, well, maybe not so much anymore. But, I guess I used to be a very kind of nostalgic person. And like, I've always loved melancholy. And I can't say that times when I've actually felt melancholy as opposed to it just being this abstraction that I would look at and appreciate and love. I can't even say that melancholy itself has really made me feel like, it feels weird to say, but like, I'm not, have you ever seen The Killing of a Chinese Bookie?
Yeah.
Yeah. When Ben Gazzara says, I'm only happy when I'm angry, when I'm sad, like that's like that's sort of been, my feeling. And, like when I read something like this, remove sorrow from your heart, if I've become kind of like less melancholic in some respects or nostalgic, does it make sense that now he says, that childhood is vanity? As an adult, do not have sorrow in your heart. Remove that. Is there something to it, or maybe you have like a different. You seem to agree when I said that like you just love melancholy. Like maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, sure. So you and I share that in common, and my favorite weather, if we just want to give those examples, would be probably two different types. Number one is deep dark of winter when it's snowing outside. And I used to love, even as a child, just bundling up and going outside to go for a walk around my neighborhood or like on my parents' property in the woods with just gentle snow coming down at twilight. It's just this cold, to most people, cold, bleak, maybe kind of miserable thing. A lot of people think snow is beautiful, of course, but that particular hour was really important to me as well. As my favorite. And then I do like rainy weather. I'm with you on like the dark, stormy, cloudy look, but I kind of like a little bit of rain, and those are my favorite times to be inside and listening to melancholy music or reading or writing, or whatever. But
what about if you're outside? Because I don't mind rain when I'm inside, but I take like multi-hour walks all the time. I don't want to deal with umbrellas and shit like that. You know what I mean? So yeah. that would really be it. And also there's something special about deep, dark cloud cover that does not culminate in rain, right? There's something special about that, in the same way that you would appreciate like fog and mist, because it's not that common, right?
Yeah, sure. So I don't mind, walking in the rain for a while. But I can see where you're coming from. But I will say also, since moving here to the Bay Area, the fog and mist that comes pretty consistently is my favorite, thing about the weather patterns here. So I enjoy that. And I guess I always felt like it adds, whether it's the snow, the dark skies, the rain, the mist, it just adds this element of drama. It makes your whole life in that moment feel kind of cinematic in a way. But certainly, like you said, with poems and poetry, like my favorite, a lot of them are great poets and poems, but my favorites also tend to be, the darker, more melancholic, people like Weldon Keys or even Wallace Stevens. Jeffers is certainly up there, and a lot of his stuff feels more, just like bleak in the face of nature. My music choices too, like you and I have talked about Elliott Smith before.
Yeah.
It's still absolutely a favorite, and very few of his songs could be considered, in any way uplifting or happy, but it's still one of my favorites. So, that attitude definitely pervades. And I think that, for me, it's just the lens through which I prefer to see the world, or maybe not even prefer, I just naturally do a lot of the time. And so, a command to remove that, I'm going to disobey on that one. Yeah. So, I think, let me just review my notes real quick. But we could probably go there. Verses 2-7 are pretty heavily poetic, and they deal with sort of the coming of God back to earth in these grand sweeping pronouncements. They're interesting, and it's just worth a read. I won't take the time to read all the way through it, but basically the sum up is still chapter 12, verse 8, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And then we click into 9-14 to wrap it up here. So if you want to read those, and then maybe we can opine a little bit.
And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yeah, he have good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished. Of making many books, there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And that's how the chapter ends.
Yeah.
And by the way, so chapter 12 is the like they think the God stuff was sort of tacked on in earlier chapters, but the entire chapter 12 is seen as this like epilogue that was just made completely after the fact, and it just sort of does feel that way. I mean, essentially, it's like, you know, although God is obviously throughout the book, like it really comes back in full force and almost like unnecessarily. You definitely feel like structurally that it is on the one hand sort of necessary now because all this God stuff was brought up at the beginning, but it's not necessarily the most satisfying conclusion, right? Because of that, perhaps.
Yeah, agreed. Especially verses 13 and 14, where it's this odd summation of everything that came before that's completely divorced from what you've read up until that point. Yeah. But yeah, you know, exactly. I mean, if we take all of chapter 12 as an add-on later, it does still read strangely. And I think you and I would agree, it would have been much more interesting for, you know, chapter 11, verse 10, therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity, would be a much more interesting and open-ended way to wrap up the book, maybe with another final verse or two if the author wanted to, but in general, to strong arm this summary with God, you know, so prominent in it, is kind of awkward and serves to undermine a lot of what came before.
One thing that this just reminded me, I was reading, I just pulled it up. That line at where was it? Line 12, and further, by these my son be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. That line of making many books there is no end, it was actually used, I think, to better effect by one of my favorite poems, and we talked about this before, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's 1800s novel in verse, Aurora Leigh. It starts out actually with the line, not of making many books there is no end, it's of writing many books there is no end. Mm-hmm. And I, who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses, will write now for mine, will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is. You know, and I think this is just like a perfect kind of conclusion to this book, because, you know, here's his book talking about labor. By the end of it, it's ready to dismiss it outright. Here is Elizabeth Barrett Browning in Aurora Leigh saying the exact opposite. She says right off the bat, writing many books, there is no end. Writing and art, right? This is an endless kind of process. And you will do it, right? You will do it as a kind of ecclesiastical labor, right? Who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses, right? You are engaging in these labors not for yourself. And finally, here she's saying she's doing it for herself. Of course, that also is vanity, right? This book is not ultimately for herself, even if she says it is. You know, it is sort of, you know, I guess about her personal predilections and dispositions and so on and so forth. But you know, clearly it is an excellent, at minimum, work, right? It is probably one of the best novels of the 19th century. And other people could have a utility from it. And, you know, I said earlier about, you know, how Ecclesiastes must have influenced other works. Well, you know, here's one example, and this is a greater work right? Then Ecclesiastes, right? Rurally could not have been possible, obviously, back then in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I think that sums it all up well. And any other just general points that we were going to touch on from my notes, I think we have as we've gone along here. So really the final thing that I put down and that I asked as a question that I think we agree on the answer, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. So just, is Ecclesiastes good as a standalone work of art if it were not part of the Bible and just its own little book of 12 poems, or perhaps one full-length poem? What would we think and how would we evaluate it?
I would answer in the following way. Just like, anytime they talk about works of art, prior to, a certain year, let's say, there's always going to be an asterisk to it, right? Ecclesiastes, okay, so it definitely has great passages, right? It has great lines that will stand, on par with any modern novel. As a totality, the fact that, arts years ago were taken as a kind of extension of religion and worship. Once you sort of assume that this is the function, you're going to put yourself in positions where, well, now we have to tack God into it. So, the addition of that final chapter is, even if it's not like bad writing, it's a flaw in some way. The fact that the ambiguities exist without A, being resolved, and B, not even giving you the lack of resolution is not that important, but the second part is more important. That second part is there's a lack of resolution without also giving you a sense really of where the writer or the narrator stands, right?
Correct.
And that is objectively a problem. You have to know where someone truly stands. And, in many cases, it's just wobbly, throughout the text. Right. And, we're saying this, even if this is, maybe, the best book in the Bible, right? Maybe the book of Job is better. I don't know. I haven't read Job in, maybe like 10 years. So I can't answer that question, off the top of my head. But, I feel like any artwork, of an old enough vintage is always going to have like a set of asterisks, right? Because it's, just like the Solomon character thinks that he's engaging in art and genuine labor by building some fucking houses, So like,
right.
That's always going to be the asterisk there.
Yeah. So that's my take, is if we go ahead and just grant the usual asterisks that we need to, still a good standalone work of art. It would hold up today if you just received it as a little chapbook of poems unto itself. It would have, some contradictions, but certainly some great lines, a lot of mystery and ambiguity, some passages that do make you put the book down to pause and reflect and think through them more deeply. It does demand rereading, and I think it rewards some rereading as you go along. Again, not every piece, but certain pieces. So I think we would finish by recommending that people give it a read, even if you're completely non-religious and never have been, and it still has merit on its own.
Yeah, it's like 20 or so pages.
It's short. Sure.
Definitely worth the read. Think about what you would normally do. You'd like fuck around on your phone for like an hour, and then you're like, "Holy fuck, what did I just do?" You could have read Ecclesiastes.
Right. You could have.
So the next part is we want to do the painting, the Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. I think one of his great paintings. And it's interesting to view it in light of the actual like biblical story, right, which is in Luke. So this is now we're moving to the New Testament, because it's interesting in the sense that when people think of religious painting, right, or anything that's like based on religion, based on a parable, based on whatever, it's all too easy to say, okay, I'm gonna like reinterpret this, but not really reinterpret it, and I'm simply going to give you, in a prosaic sense, what the parable entails, like what it meant, purely in plot or even like in narrative. That's always insufficient, right? If you're going to take a biblical story, you're going to have to do something with it, right? And I think Rembrandt does it really well in that painting. So maybe you could do the screen share, since I don't have that painting up on my screen.
Sure, I've got it.
Yeah. So actually, like let's pull it up, and as we pull it up, I'm going to read the parable from Luke.
All right. So hopefully everyone watching would now be able to see the Rembrandt painting there. And this is pretty much as large as I can make it on my screen. So
I think that's good enough.
Okay.
So as you're just looking at the painting and thinking about what you see there, this is the parable that it's based on. It's Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would fain have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Now his elder son was in the field. And as he came and drew nigh to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said unto him, Thy brother is come, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And he was angry, and he would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him. And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment. And yet thou never gavest me a kid, that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come, which hath devoured thy living with harlots, thou hast killed for him that fatted calf. And he said unto him, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead, and is alive again, and was lost and is found. So, and I mean, we could continue talking with the screen share. I find it interesting because like the parable as it's written, right? It literally can't be this depiction that we see on the screen, right? Because here, we have the father running to the son. I don't think in the situation the father ran to the son. In fact, it looks like the exact opposite. It looks like the son ran to the father, and you have evidence of this. Like you see that little shoe at the bottom. Mm-hmm. That's such a marvelous little touch, right? Like you see in the fact that the shoe has come off and the other shoe has not. It just must have slipped off as he was kneeling, right? Maybe out of excitement, maybe for some other reason. The other shoe stayed on. So like you have the tension, right? You have you have the motion of the image before, the image that's actually in front of you, right? You have this kind of cinematic scope, right? The cinematic quality that a great painter is able to produce, right? You think it's like a throwaway little detail, but it's not. Like that tension, it's important for this moment, right? You can imagine a kind of a riot of motion before we get to this point. The only evidence that you have for that riot of motion comes from the slipper that's been thrown off. I have more things to say, but I've talked enough. So I guess whatever.
Yeah.
You have.
Yeah, definitely. The shoe is a highly important detail, probably the most important individual detail in the whole piece. It also looks as though maybe like the father and whoever else is around him, we don't know exactly who these characters are. Maybe we're assuming one or two of them are servants, but there's this pretty royally clad figure that looks similar to the father's robes on the right-hand side, which maybe is the elder son. If you know, feel free to say, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, they have guesses, right? Like they say, for example, I think they're saying that this might be like a tax collector. But whenever people say stuff like that, there's no reason. Like, why would you make that assumption, right? That's kind of it's. I mean, it could be the elder brother. Right. He does look younger than the father. Right. I'm not exactly. I don't think Jesus in this parable says exactly how big the age differential is. So, we just have like a younger and older brother. It could be that. And if it is the brother, number one, like it does change some of what's happening in the parable because you don't see the kind of action that the parable actually states, like in the words. And also you don't get the sense, like if this is in fact the brother, you don't get the sense that this is anyway, I'm talking again. You were in the middle of something. I need to stop.
Yeah. Save that thought. Hopefully we can come back to it. But yeah, so my thought was just going to be that, for this interpretation, let's say that it is the elder brother.
Yeah.
And therefore, once again, it's a really interesting narrative change on Rembrandt's part because he's here peacefully watching over this embrace of the father for the younger son. And he's described as angry and upset in the parable itself. And maybe he does still harness those emotions, but here at least he's looking more pensive and reflective. Maybe he's even at this moment, interpreting what all of this might mean and trying to absorb some kind of life lesson from his father, or maybe he still vehemently disagrees with what his father's doing here and is just, pitying his younger brother. We don't really know, but anyway, the ambiguity of that is kind of interesting. And so I think also just important that Rembrandt chooses this moment of the parable, like you said, where things have calmed down a little bit from the initial like running in of the younger brother and maybe a bit of like a frenzied attitude and even the father's excitement at that. But here the father is still looking like bitter or disappointed or sorrowful, maybe to use our theme from Ecclesiastes, and it looks like he's kind of caught up in a number of different emotions now that this moment has actually arrived and he's holding his son. He seems conflicted maybe between, pleasure at that, but also perhaps even wondering if he's doing the right thing by welcoming him back here. Now, I mean, obviously, in a broader sense, the meaning of the parable is pretty straightforward in terms of what Jesus means with, God giving forgiveness and redemption to people who don't deserve it. But anyway, and it's just a gorgeous painting too. As a side note, I mean, on a technical level, classic Rembrandt stuff with the chiaroscuro. It's very deep and intense here. Looks like maybe there's a doorway that the younger son came through that's casting light into this room. But just beautiful everything, in terms of the presentation as well.
And like the most interesting part of these situations would be the the after effect, like it would be the emotion, right? It would not be like the frenzy and the excitement, like the thing, like the Jeffers would say, like where would the greatness reside? It would be in the peace, right? The after effect, right? The peace that's emerging here, where people, they none of their mouths look like they're moving, right? They're now just in thought, right? There is at a certain point not enough words to go around. There's nothing to say. And if you scroll up again a little bit, one thing that I often thought about this painting was how, the upper right portion of the canvas, right? This is what I tweeted something to this effect when I first tweeted out this painting. Like if you just magnify that portion of the painting, right, and you just blow it up, right? You blow it up and you zoom into it, and you sort of say, this is my Abex painting. Like it's just worthless, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? But in context of what's actually happening, we don't see any kind of like anything that would be indicative of like wealth. We don't see finely cut walls. We don't see anything except this like amorphous nothingness that honestly to me it just looks like what we in the modern age think of as thought bubbles, right? Because the emphasis is on what are these people thinking, right? These are all of their like little abstractions, right? These are all their little thoughts, perhaps like cropping up, right? So if you interpret this essentially as thought bubbles, this works as an abstraction far better than a totally disconnected kind of abstraction, meaning like disembodied and disconnected from the real world, right? Like you actually have something going on here, and you could say that there is something emerging here that this part of the painting is adding to.
Yeah, all good comments. I'll scroll down here because I think. And this sort of gets to your point a little bit further, or maybe it's on this page here. Right here, this zoom in on the father's face and the technique, right? So again, like if I zoom and we get real tight in there and it starts to look Abex again, right? And Rembrandt in his later style, this is something he's very much praised for to this day, is these more frenzied, hurried brush strokes and laying the paint on thick and not going for that hyper glossed realism. He kind of ushered in or helped usher in some of this more sketchy kind of style. But here, I mean, still this eye alone, like when you really look at it, there's not that many strokes almost or something, hardly any detail, yet it still conveys this expression and this emotion and this odd, just creates again some ambiguity, like this little turn of the eye to the side while the father is embracing the son. What could that mean?
You can't definitively say, oh, this is clearly. You can't do that, right?
No.
But you can also say the following: it is clearly an indication of some kind of thought, some kind of thinking. You don't have to know what it is. Like, the story, right? You know the story behind it. This does not have to be a literal interpretation of the story, simply because you have that skeleton in there. This is where, Rembrandt is allowing the viewer to actually do some work, right? This is now your turn to make these kinds of judgment calls.
Yeah, exactly right. And great artists doing what they do extremely well. And so, yeah, nice palate cleanser, as you phrased it, after going pretty in depth on Ecclesiastes. I have a couple little like surprise ending pieces here to wrap this up.
Okay.
With some poems actually that I kind of thought of while I was reading Ecclesiastes. I don't know if you had anything extra before we maybe wrap up this segment.
No, because I actually have something extra for the After Dark, which will be explosive, and highly controversial and totally unexpected.
Okay. Well, I don't have anything extra for that section, so perfect. You can take that. I'll take this. So let me just get back out of the screen share here and come back to our view. Okay. So just two quick poems. So now it's interesting that you mentioned Countee, Cullen, unprompted by me. I'm not surprised that you did, but there are a number of Cullen poems that I think maybe we could have picked from. He was a religious person, throughout his whole life, but similar to Ecclesiastes, never was like totally sure of himself and of his faith, and kind of cast interesting doubts sometimes at God and at himself and his relation to God. And there's a lot of wonderful poems of his that do that. You have a great analysis of his poem Heritage from your Ideas on Ideas site, but this is just a quick one that I thought I would read. This is just from Countee Cullen's collected poems. So this one's called Gods. I fast and pray and go to church and put my penny in, but God's not fooled by such slight tricks, and I'm not saved from sin. I cannot hide from him the gods that revel in my heart, nor can I find an easy word to tell them to depart. God's alabaster turrets gleam too high for me to win, unless he turns his face and lets me bring my own gods in. And just a kind of off-putting take in a way on Countee Cullen having his own gods and needing to bring those along still, even if he's going to pledge allegiance and devotion to the Christian God.
Yeah.
And some question marks about doing what God asks of him, putting his penny in, but he's still not cleansed of sin, and these kind of things. So that was one. And then the other one is Robinson.
Well, just to comment on that, like, just connecting that with Heritage, like, a couple ways that we could discuss, like, the gods that he's talking about here is, number one, it could be as simple as, like, in Heritage, when he's saying, my native gods are actually, the African pagan gods. And, am I betraying God for either thinking of them, or am I betraying my heritage for thinking of the Christian God? So that's one thing. But, the other thing, the gods inside you could be anything that you have this, like, ideological commitment to, any zealotry towards. And, like we talked about earlier, like we're just as zealous as we were, as when we were religious. Right.
Could even mean, exactly. His propensity for poetry. Being an artist and needing to bring that along. So that was one. And then another short one here. This is from Robinson Jeffers, and speaks a bit to what we talked about early in Ecclesiastes, with that sort of defeatist attitude in a way, with everything being meaningless and what to do it for, but also still retaining a sense of awe and wonder at the world around you. So to the stonecutters fighting time with marble, you four defeated challengers of oblivion, eat cynical earnings, knowing rock splits, records fall down, the square-limbed Roman letters scale in the thaws, wear in the rain. The poet as well builds his monument mockingly, for man will be blotted out, the blithe earth die, the brave sun die blind and blackened to the heart. Yet stones have stood for 1,000 years, and pained thoughts found the honey of peace in old poems.
Yeah. I did not know the first poem. Maybe it's a new one from the new Countee Cullen collection, but I've heard this one before. And it's interesting because Jeffers had this perspective, and it makes me wonder, like, So, like, the one hand, he's one of these people that believes that everything more or less turns to dust. But he kind of he spent his whole life writing like a lot of poetry, right? Thousands of pages of poetry. And it just makes me wonder, like, did he interpret his life in the sense that he would interpret the life of an animal, right? Animals do what they do and then they die. People do what they do and when they die. And in his case, what people do is to write poetry, right? Because that was the function. Just like an animal's function might be something totally prosaic and different. This is his function within the limits of what his culture is, right? What his probable course of actions might be.
Right. And a little bit of a sly dig there, and similar to the themes in Ecclesiastes we talked about, where he writes this poem to the stonecutters, but essentially says that what they've built won't last. But in that final line, that people still find the honey of peace in old poems. So it's writing, it's poetry, it's art that has this ability to endure. And so, yeah, I thought those, there's plenty of others we could have looked at and picked, but those both seemed applicable, and I read them both fairly recently.
Yeah. So. Honestly, the best argument against all the naysaying and all the defeatist attitudes and all the melancholy in Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes, right? Like it's kind of like its own proof against itself.
Subverts itself, yeah.
That and that's just the interesting part of all of it. In the same way that people that make all their clever arguments about the subjectivity in the arts, the biggest and best argument against all that is just observe their actual behavior after they're done with their abstract discussions and after they're done with their words, right? A fool is known by a multitude of words. So wrap it up here, and we will see everybody